Good morning, and thank you to you all for joining us today. My name is Gareth Miller. I'm Head of Change at Artemis Investment Management and also co-chair of the Smart Working Workstream of the Diversity Project. In partnership with How Do You Do It, a remote control, we're excited to be launching our guide today for people managers, offering practical solutions to make hybrid working work. I'm now going to hand across to Paul and the authors of the report, Fran and Debs. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gareth, and thank you all for making the time to join today's session. My name is Paul Halstead, and I'm the HR Director supporting CarVal Investors, a US headquartered asset manager across our various locations in Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. I dare say, like many of us on this webinar, CarVal has been through a journey with respect to making hybrid working part of our employee experience and workplace culture, and it's very much an ongoing journey. With ups and downs along the way as we've learned what works best for our business, for our investors, and for our people. And we're very much looking forward to sharing some of that learning with you in today's session. And over to Francie.
Thank you, Paul. Very happy to be here. I'm Fran, co-founder of Remote Control. It's a consultancy I set up in 2020 to help people and organizations shift to a more sustainable way of remote working and hybrid work through sharing best practice of high-performing distributed teams. My background is in the investment management industry, having spent 12 years in communication prior to that in asset management and investment management. And now I lead people operations for a remote-only and globally distributed organization in the blockchain. Thank you.
Thanks, Fran. So good morning, everybody. My name's Debs Ingham. I'm the EMEA director at a company called How Do You Do It? So we work with individuals, their managers, and also the wider organisation in terms of running award-winning coaching programmes that support flexible and inclusive workplaces. So throughout the pandemic, we've supported teams across a range of organisations who are rapidly adapting to this changing and ongoing changing working environment.
Thank you, Debs. Just wanted to let everybody know that this session is now being recorded and we may be hosting the session later on social media, including the Diversity Project website. So, as you know, this webinar coincides with the launch of our new guide on making hybrid working work in the investment industry, and we'll be sharing that guide on the screen momentarily. We'll also send you the web link to the guide in the chat window, and you can expect to receive a follow-up mail in the next couple of days that will include links to the guide and other useful resources on hybrid working. Before we get stuck into some of the specific learnings about hybrid working, we just wanted to take a few minutes to set out the aims of the guide, to tell you a little bit about how it came into being, and also to provide an overview of how it's structured. So in terms of purpose, the overall aim has been to provide a guide that helps managers and leaders to identify and address some of the challenges that we may be facing in the investment industry as we move from COVID-related remote working to more business as usual work patterns, including more formalized hybrid work arrangements. Our emphasis throughout has been on practicality and providing a useful framework to help businesses and managers to address the opportunities and challenges that hybrid working can present. In terms of how the guide evolved, as Gareth mentioned, the Smart Working Committee of the Diversity Project commissioned industry-specific research, working with Debs and Francine, with a range of participant firms. This included conducting a number of discovery calls with managers about their experiences of remote and hybrid working, both during and following the COVID pandemic. The participants' firms varied quite considerably and included large multinational investment managers employing several thousand employees through to much smaller boutique asset managers with workforces of less than 30. We also included a range of professional service firms, including independent wealth advisors, accountancy practices, and tax advisors. As I said, the intention has been to create a guide that is easy to read and engaging to work with. And as such, it's divided into three main sections. each representing the key stages that managers may be at in their hybrid journeys. However, at this point, it's important to note that embracing and adopting hybrid working is not a simple linear tick box exercise. And indeed, our research and experiences have suggested and shown that firms may well be working at all three stages simultaneously. And this is where we're experiencing progress in some areas, but we may be facing challenges and setbacks in others. So it's very much a dynamic, recursive process. The three main sections of the guide are, firstly, understanding the challenges presented by hybrid. Secondly, how best to go about setting up for success. And then thirdly, how we can build cultures that keep working for the longer term. And with that, I would like to hand over to Debs to look in a bit more depth at really understanding the challenges presented by hybrid.
Thank you, Paul. So building on what Paul's just said there, one of the things that we found as we reached out to the members of the Smart Working workstream was there was this consistent theme that managers were often, feeling isolated and really would benefit from some additional support in terms of making this move towards a hybrid culture. And that's really what motivated the workstream to look into providing this guide. So section 1 is very much thinking about those audiences where organisations are still really deciding on their approach to the world of work at the moment. Now, broadly, what we heard in our sort of discovery calls and our work with the different managers across those different organisations is in these organisations, nothing's been formalised in terms of adopting hybrid or flexible working. And in truth, there is an expectation that there will be a return to the office full time at some point, probably in the near future. Now, the impact we discovered this was having on managers is really that, for them, a flexible approach to work is new. I think most of those managers felt that during the sort of enforced working from home period during the lockdown, they were very much waiting for a return. It was something that they were dealing with, what felt very short term. It certainly wasn't felt that it was going to be this protracted. Therefore, now that there is a sense of actually this may be here to stay in some format, they are unsure on how to get started and really embed this and what really some of those key considerations need to be. So in this section, bearing in mind that that's where those organisations are, this was very much about understanding the challenges and how to address them. So it's really underpinned by what we were consistently hearing about managers often feeling caught between the organisation's evolving expectations and a sense of empowerment actually felt by employees over the ways of working and really what works best for them at that individual level. We've actually, I think many of you will identify, have seen this evidenced in the current recruitment market across the industry. So we now can see that candidates are absolutely prioritising flex or hybrid working as an essential or a non-negotiable rather than a perk or an added benefit pre-pandemic. So the aim in this section is really about getting the manager to focus on the practical and maybe some reflective steps that they can be taking to support themselves, so they can balance effective team management with the delivery of their team's objectives. Now, one of the first steps here is about engaging with facts. So facts that are true to their organisation. So for example, getting real clarity on what's the company's latest policy, where that's mandated or there's some clear guidelines versus where there's actually some manager discretion. Then combining this with some really core team management skills. So getting really comfortable with managing differing needs across a team, really thinking about their own management and their own work preferences, and actually recognising how this might be impacting on their own actions and their behaviours in relation to the team. So a key part of this is recognising they're not going through this evolution of their role as a manager alone. Connecting with other managers has been a key value that we've heard reported back from our coaching groups in terms of learning from others' experience, but also increasing your own awareness and understanding of the different types of team leadership and actually how effective they can be in this new environment. So to sort of bring that to life, one example we heard recently from an organisation we were working with a group of managers. One manager disclosed how one of their regular team meetings really does involve debate and challenge as a team. So it's quite an intense meeting, and they found that it's far more successful if that's conducted in person. So he actually felt personally responsible to find a day that suited everyone, which with various personal constraints across the team wasn't actually a particularly easy task. And so subsequently, they'd slipped into a routine of making it an online or a hybrid meeting, which the team as a whole agreed really wasn't as successful in terms of output. So having revisited the company guidance on hybrid working, he then felt supported to establish as the team leader a protocol around an in-person meeting for that specific task. He then shared that with the team, and that enabled them to reach an agreement as a team on how they could make this work. So Fran's now going to take you through the second section of the guide.
Thank you, Debs. So in the second section, setting a team up for success, our target audience for this section were the organizations where, although no formal hybrid working policy is in place yet, the majority of these organizations have returned to the office for a couple of days a week, and they are working in hybrid mode. But many of the organizations we spoke to are still operating on their contingency plans for hybrid work and what was the world's largest working from home experiment. We recognize from that, and we've seen over the last couple of years, that new hybrid working strategies take time to set up and become the new norm for everyone. But what we found, and what we've spoken to the managers who are doing it well, that when it's done well, it can really help your team feel fully supported in their new routine. So the aim of this section were to highlight the key areas that we found make hybrid working a success. We focus on a number of areas, including communication, that's the big one, documentation for hybrid work, and of course, digital tools. It's no surprise to anyone when I say that hybrid work is the most challenging model to run successfully, and a big reason for this is communication. It's something that came up again and again during our discovery calls with managers, and during those conversations with the managers, we heard the same concerns again: the communication gaps that were emerging when half of their teams were in the office and half were online. So here we focused on some ultra practical steps that managers could consider when adopting to improve hybrid communication. One example that we share is how to set clear communication principles. So much is lost in translation, and we've all been there, misreading an email, like when we're physically not together. So to overcome this, we advise to over communicate, and for this, it's essential to have the right communication channels in place and touch points in place. Here, with I would say adopting an asynchronous approach or remote first to communication for online chats and emails is a real winner and helps where possible. And luckily, we've seen how many tools are out there over the last couple of years, and there are new ones every day that help make communication easy for teams. But on the flip side of this, we want to encourage managers to say that it's okay to not have their teams be hyper responsive and responding in real time. So it's okay to do deep work. And we found that the managers we spoke to that allow and encourage deep work and notifications switched off really see productivity and happiness of their employees on the up. Of course, what we'd say is, and of course, this document for managers, leading by example is the best way to help encourage new norms and new hybrid working practices. If as a manager, we'd say do put deep focus work in your calendar and encourage others to do the same, and avoid that dreaded tech overdrive and of course online presenteeism. Another area that we highlighted after speaking to managers in this section is the importance of documentation. And moving to hybrid work requires your team's documentation to be on point. So we're talking everything that you need, from policies, processes, meeting notes. and team processes, so that the team need to operate remotely. We highlight in the guide, it's great to have a remote first approach and a single source of truth for all of your documentation, and then that it's kept up to date by the whole team and not just you as a manager or one person individually. It's a team effort. One final point I want to make on this section is that the hybrid working techniques require trial and error, and the managers we spoke to, some approaches work and some don't. So we encourage our managers to take time to assess what suits their team and speak to other managers about what works for their team also. So hopefully there's some tips that you can take and tips that you might leave and try for another time. And that's wrapping up section 2. Over to you, Debs, for section 3.
Thanks, Fran. And that absolutely the point Fran made there about really all organizations we're talking to within this industry, but also wider industries, very much are in this test and retest phase. It's not something, there isn't one silver bullet answer, and that was very much at the heart of what we were looking to provide when we put the guide together. So the third section, going back to Paul's point about, you may recognize that your organization as a whole is at one of these stages. Similarly, you may recognize that individual, business units or even down to a team level are in really quite different places. So that makes each of them relevant to you at different levels. So this final stage is section 3. And the target audience here was really very much about those organizations or teams and managers who have fully embraced a formal hybrid culture. What we're seeing in those organizations is they have moved away from having mandatory in-office days. The majority have returned to the office for at least 2 days per week, but we are seeing formal policies for this new norm being circulated. In some places, flexi hours or flexi days are actually being written into contracts, and there are very much evidence of hybrid best practices in place. So things like remote first meetings and some of the ideas and suggestions that Fran just talked about from section 2. Now, the impact we found on the managers who feel that they're in this phase or this stage, these managers are really looking to create that sense of team cohesion in tandem with being highly productive in a way that existed in that full-time in-office world, but actually now requires quite a different approach because we've got that reduced in-person contact. So this section we titled Building a Team Culture That Works. And it really is looking at some of the longer term implications and how managers can continue to adapt, continue to evolve and build a great team culture when that in-person contact is far more limited than we've been used to historically. Now, similar to Fran's point with section 2, quality and effective communication is absolutely a theme for managers throughout the guide. And this section really dives into this in more detail. It's got the aim of really ensuring the team dynamic is positive. So team members are feeling engaged, they're feeling enabled to really contribute to the team's objectives. Now, part of this includes being really clear on the team purpose, the team's outputs, but it's also being prepared to acknowledge and really proactively address when things aren't working. So if there are tensions that are starting to build, it's about identifying them in your role as a manager and really proactively addressing them. So nipping them in the bud as soon as possible. So the final section really recognises that the world of work is continuing to evolve. We haven't made it yet. We're not at the end of this. And it's really evolving across all business, not only in this industry. And therefore, what we're noticing is effective managers really need to continue their own development as team leaders, so being really skilled in this area. So what we wanted to do is really capture this through a series of really practical orientated questions that managers can use to reflect on periodically so they can ensure that they're staying on track. Now, these can also be used effectively within manager networks. So if you are able to group together managers as a cohort, they can reflect and share experiences on what's working well and less well in their teams that really moves the whole organisation forward, at the same time as really investing and developing their own management skills and capabilities. So a recent example to sort of bring this section to life is around that sort of recognition around how we operated in a pre-pandemic world and how we are now moving as successful managers in a more hybrid way of working. So if we think about some of those processes that were in place that maybe haven't moved forward, and this example talked about a current career progression process, which previously would have reflected a time when everyone was full-time office-based. So many managers were reporting the importance of exposure and advocacy as a real part of that embedded way organisations were making decisions in relation to promotions. Now, as a manager, it's really important that you are noting any negative consequences of hybrid working on those old established processes that actually may need revisiting and refining now that the working world is evolving. So over back to you, Paul.
Thank you, Debs. We'd like to begin to look at some of those questions that we've received already about hybrid working in a moment, but we would encourage you to please use the chat facility in Zoom. If you've got any additional questions or any comments you'd like to make, please do share them, and we'll spend the next 20 minutes or so looking at those with you. If we don't get to all the questions during today's session, then please do just reach out to us via the contact details that you'll receive in the next couple of days via email. They're also on the back of the guide, and I think we've just posted them in the chat as well. So to begin with, one question that we received from a number of people was, how can we go about successfully onboarding new employees in a hybrid work environment? Perhaps Fran, if you could start us on that one.
Yeah, absolutely, Paul. It's a great question, and it's something that came up during many conversations that we've had. I guess it's because people had to overnight onboard people remotely, and now that they're in a hybrid setup, they're finding themselves with their own set of challenges. So I put some tips on this in section 2 of the guide that I'd be happy to run through. But what I'd say is the challenges lie that when you're onboarding people without the office tour or the welcome lunch, or not everybody's in the office at the same time, it can easily make the new hire feel that they are isolated when they join and they don't know who's who. So I think it's really important to rethink the way you're onboarding new employees, and even rethink and design how you're pre-boarding new employees in a hybrid setup. So we found out that it's no secret that a well thought out onboarding procedure is it really works well here, and it also leaves a really great first impression on the employee and helps them feel engaged from the get-go. And in the guide, you'll find that we break the onboarding down to 5 key steps that you need to look at. And I can just briefly go into them. The first one is like setting your clear onboarding process. So when the new hire joins in day 1, they are ready to go and it seems really smooth. And also preparing for that new hire in advance with all the legal documents that they need, if they need access from day 1, so that they can get their key meetings on board, the orientation meetings, and they know what's happening. Another key area, and something that we found, if you focus on your sharing your company values and your mission and your vision with new employees, they feel part and welcome of the organization. So if in a hybrid work environment you can't do this, you could have a one-to-one remote, or you could have an async video that they can read and documents they can check up on before they have a meeting with you. The other section we do, which is so great, and is setting up a work buddy. Doesn't necessarily have to be in the team for the new hire. It can be in another team, and it's just somebody that's there to answer any questions. You know, there are no stupid questions when you're onboarding, but sometimes if you're onboarding remote, you can't just turn around to the person next to you and ask them. So having that highly effective work buddy is a great step. And last but not least, providing clarity from the day 1 on what the communication norms were, which I spoke about earlier. And so there's no confusion. If your new hire needs to contact someone, they know what to do. But ultimately, with the more planning you put in, the smoother it will be for the employee, and they will feel far more likely to want to stick around.
Great, thank you, Fran, and thank you for the questions which we can see coming in via chat. Thank you very much. We'll come to those momentarily, I hope. A second question that has come up is, what does the research suggest about employees who may be taking time off due to illness whilst working remotely, and how can we best manage this?
Paul, so shall I pick this up, Paul?
Please.
I mean, what's been quite interesting is, I mean, there's been some quite recent data coming out of the Office for National Statistics, which is really showing that the sickness absence rate for those people who work from home, so that could be a remote or hybrid arrangement, has fallen. So that's down to under 1%, so at 0.9% compared to 2.2% for those people who are still working in the workplace or attending office environments. That's then been mirrored by the CIPD. So they found that 70% of people who replied to their 2021 survey reported that staff are actually using annual leave for sickness or to catch up on work, suggesting that this idea of sickness presenteeism is absolutely prevalent. And when people are working from home, there is that temptation of, so when I might not be well enough to make it into the office, but I could still log on and I will still work and I don't want to get behind, and so various pressures. So there are clearly downsides to the individual in terms of doing that. Interestingly, there's research out there that's also showing there's absolutely downsides to the business beyond that impact on staff. So there are studies showing that obviously working when ill can lead to mistakes. Another suggesting that, you know, that sickness presenteeism actually produces lower productivity and lower performance. We've got studies in the US and Australia that showing presenteeism actually costs more to the overall economy than being absent. So in terms of what I think can be done, I think it's really important that organisations via their managers are supporting employees so that they feel comfortable stepping away to recover from illness. Now, this is where, you know, from a practical point of view as a manager, it's about being really proactive, of having a very simple conversation around expectations, that it's okay to take time off if you're unwell. But also the flip side of that is, you know, the importance of role modeling this behavior too. It's not about being the martyr if you're the manager or the team leader. It's about you also acknowledging out loud to others that if you are unwell, you are prioritizing your recovery by taking time off. And that means stepping away from screen time and then temptation to be online if you're not coming into the office.
Thanks, Debs. And I would add to that from an HR perspective as well, to re-emphasize your existing procedures and policies. Just because you're not on site, where obviously it's more visible if you're not coming in due to illness, those policies and procedures apply equally if you're working remotely, and really to ensure, as Deb's just said, that it's seen to be acceptable to indicate that you're not at work. Again, technology can help for that. Within Carval, we use Slack as a tool quite extensively, where you can actually indicate that you're feeling under the weather. And your managers, again, the key role that managers have in making sure that is the case in practice too. We've received a number of questions, and maybe if we have a look at one of these that relates to in relation to promotion processes. So the question is from Caroline: in relation to promotion processes, have you identified trending changes that some firms are making to account for the impact of hybrid? And maybe if I start with this one, this is something that we've been evolving at Carval over a number of years. We started pre-pandemic as a relatively small firm, less than 200 employees globally, but with 8 offices that are internationally distributed. We were receiving feedback that if you weren't present in our headquarters, you were out of sight, not necessarily having full consideration when it came to our annual promotion processes. Which is a situation which is a little bit akin to remote working. If you're not actually in the office, how can you ensure that people will be taking into account your contribution, what you're doing, in terms of access to rewards, promotion, whatever that may be. We'd begun to look at addressing that pre-pandemic, but I think our experiences really drove that forward. So we start our promotion process earlier now. It is one that is consistently global, where managers actually are required to submit a list of potential promotees. We share job criteria as well, so people can better understand, managers can better understand what people need to be doing, contributing, displaying at various levels in the organization to be in a position to be considered ready for promotion. We then collect data from a range of different sources internally using a multi-rater feedback system, also from manager themselves. And we actually then combine that data. That's done by the Carval HR team, and a global meeting is hosted virtually where candidates are reviewed by the senior leadership team using a consistent set of criteria. It's not perfect, but certainly we've been using that process now and continue to evolve it over 2 years. And we're finding that that does at least enable a consistency of approach, people being aware of what the process involves. And in terms of senior leadership, actually coming together to work on that collaboratively. And we always ensure that people who are being promoted are told that they are up for promotion or not, and provide reasons for that. I don't know, Deb.
Yes,
Francine,
no, Paul, I would, yeah, just to add to that. So what I love in terms of what I'm hearing there and what I'm seeing in those organisations who are on the front foot in terms of looking at those processes is the fact that you've got transparency at the heart of this. So it's not a closed shop in terms of the leadership understand what the game is around promotion. It's the fact that right throughout the organisation, everybody understands. You've looked at it as an opportunity to relook at the process rather than this being something that you're having to do in a reactive state. I think the other piece in this, which is really important, bearing in mind we're talking about the supporting and the upskilling potentially of managers here, is really getting managers to understand what their role can be as part of this in terms of supporting those individuals who are on that promotion journey. So there is, again, almost back to that stage one, there's a bit about really understanding what the process is here in your organisation so that they can be really clear on what it is and what's required, what's being looked for. But at the same time, recognizing the role they can play. So I think often, regardless of whether we're in person or we're, remote, the idea of exposure and advocacy is still important when it comes to human decision making around promotion. And what that just means is we are going to be much more creative in terms of how we go about that, how we develop those wider relationships with wider stakeholders when it comes to thinking about promotion. We haven't got access perhaps to the same people in the same way when we were in office, where we could, have informal conversations. We could put time in an impromptu way or flexible or spontaneous way in people's diaries, conversation in the coffee queue and so on. So we need to think more creatively about how we do that and how we engage with those wider stakeholders when we are working in this hybrid way.
Just to add to that, thank you, Debs. I agree with everything, and Paul as well. Just a final point on transparency as well. It also leads to being transparent about the team's goals and objectives, and especially in a hybrid work environment. I've seen a question come through there about, like productivity is higher for this individual in the hybrid mode, and it's really allowing that to shine through. So focusing on outputs and showing that being transparent about the goals and objectives of the team that are delivered, regardless of whether their employees are hybrid or in the office, and focusing on that is a really great approach, and especially when it comes to showing who's being promoted and backing up the reasons why.
Thank you. And Caroline, thank you for the question. We hope that's been helpful. I'm conscious, I'm just looking at the time, and thank you so much for sending in the questions. Just to manage expectations, I know we're not going to get to all of those today, but as I said, we'd be happy to follow up offline beyond today's session. Another question that we have received, which I think affects many of us, is how can we best manage meetings in a hybrid environment? And how do we manage those risks of those people not physically being in the room, being excluded from those debates?
I can take this one, Paul, if you want. I think it's so important here to have a consistent hybrid culture, and that's just to ensure that people aren't second guessing what the procedure is, and that goes for meetings as well. So to ensure that everyone's has the same working experience, so regardless of whether they're in the office or remote. And for this, taking your meetings online, if at least one person is remote, is a game changer for your team. And this avoids the big split of the two different cultures that would emerge, of having somebody, the culture that's in the office and the remote culture, and the conflict that might evolve around that. So I would say, and many organizations that we spoke to have adapted to this approach quite well, which is to have that remote first approach to meetings. And on that note, it's also a great idea to also set your virtual meeting etiquette. For example, treating your meeting, regardless of whether it's remote or in person, the same. So having your agenda set, keeping to time, and preparing as you would for in-person meetings, and always sharing that agenda in advance. So simple steps, but sometimes when meetings are put in the diary, they're not followed, and you can see that they can quickly go to bad habits. So I think always having that process in place helps.
And something that I'd add to that, Anne, is Anne, is there's been some really excellent tips that have evolved out of everybody's learning from this. And one community, so the neurodiverse community, they've come up with some really excellent tips that they really feel help level those meetings for everybody involved, just to really ensure it's totally inclusive and lots of inclusive behaviours. So for example, things like when you are using video calls, offering choice around the camera being on or off. Partly this is because some people will find lots of squares of people moving in different lighting and different backgrounds very distracting, or actually quite intimidating in terms of making a contribution. Whereas for others, actually having a visual reference when there's a voice is really helpful. So recognizing there are different ways that people will be most productive and will connect and contribute best during a video call is really helpful. So really thinking about, as a team, setting those protocols that Fran's just talked about in what works best for us, what works best for our team, in terms of making sure that this meeting format is really inclusive, but also really productive.
Great, thank you, Debs. And I think just building on that sort of intra-team communication between team members, communications between managers and employees. Just looking at another question that's come in from Sarah. My company and my boss believe that they are doing me a favor by allowing hybrid working. However, in hybrid mode, I've taken on more work and see this as an overall benefit to the company. I do more work on home days rather than spend 3 hours per day traveling. Many of my team feel the same way. How should I address this? Which is a great question. I think brings into mind a host of issues, including boundary management, which can be particularly challenging in a hybrid work environment. If we compare that to the physical office, where many of us, our actual working day is largely dictated around a train timetable or a tube timetable or a need to get home to do something, they become very blurred in the hybrid setting. And indeed, especially across international organizations, it's so easy to take that call from the US or get up and start a little bit earlier if you're supporting businesses in Asia. I think we've experienced that in my organization, and it's really about ensuring there's that high quality dialogue and communication within the team, between team members and individuals. And I don't know the context of Sarah's question, but really, I would suggest helping the manager to understand actually what you are doing, and the fact that those 3 extra days are being worked There are risks with that as well, some of which are highlighted in the guide. The research consistently shows that not being able to manage or having a sense of control over managing boundaries runs risks in terms of well-being, burnout, which ultimately is not good for us as employees, and it's certainly not good for the business. Debs, Fran, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, I think it goes to Fran's point earlier when she was saying about, it's really key that there are these discussions happening between managers and their teams in terms of agreed outputs. So what's the objective of the team as a whole? And does everybody understand their part and their responsibility in terms of their contribution to that? Then in terms of how people are delivering, that often comes down to preference. And I think equally in the same way that Sarah has identified that for her, she's able to be more productive because of maybe the nature of some of her tasks is about being home-based. Equally, I think what would be interesting was to understand from the manager's perspective where there seems to be a mismatch of, what the manager's view is on productivity and output and achieving goals from, an overall team perspective in terms of how that's best done. For me, the crux of this is about you're trying to find a solution that wins for both parties. This isn't about, the organization being heavy-handed or the team manager being heavy-handed and dictatorial about this is how we're going to operate. Equally, it's not about the employee digging their heels in and saying, but this works best for me. It's about recognizing there may be certain activities and certain tasks that if they are done in a certain way, and that may mean being in person, then actually that for the team as a whole is where you will get to the output that you're looking for. Equally, recognizing that absolutely we can agree there are certain tasks and activities where you perform absolutely at your best if you're less distracted, you're not in a loud office, you haven't got to negotiate a long commute, for example. It's about that being very open about how you work at your best, but equally where the team has got to deliver and what those agreed outputs are. And I think sometimes because we've been working this way for a long time, maybe there isn't that clarity around the expectations on what the team's ultimate objectives and deliverables are rather than at the individual level. And I think that discussion can be really helpful in terms of sharing the understanding of both positions so you can get to a point where everybody is getting what they need.
Great. Thank you, Debs. And I'm so sorry, the time is running away with us. We're going to have to draw things to a conclusion, but I'm sure we could continue talking about this for a very long time. We'd love to do that. But as I said, please do share any questions beyond today's session using the contact details on the Diversity Project website or those that are being shared on the chat box now. We will be reaching out to each of you with a follow-up mail, as I said. We'd really like to conclude today's session with 3 specific calls to action. Firstly, we'd encourage you to read the guide. Do have a look. It contains a lot of useful material, but really is 10 pages of context in there. We've tried to set it out in a very punching and engaging manner. Secondly, if you're already embracing hybrid working, then keep on going. Regularly review what's working well, what's perhaps working less well, where there are difficulties. Consider using the guide to help monitor your approach. There's some terrific questions there. I'm looking at page 7 now on how you can keep evolving and improving your practices. And thirdly, if you're at the beginning of the journey or yet to start, think about how you'll start to have that dialogue within your organization about hybrid. Who will you speak with? What do you want to achieve in the first weeks or months? And do use the guide to help structure those conversations in your planning. So from all of us, we'd like to thank you again for joining this session and all the very best as you continue on your journey. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.